Hi, and welcome to my channel. My name is Lizzie, and I will be discussing a very important topic that really hasn't been discussed much despite its complicated, vast history and cultural impact. I will be telling you the history of America trying to erase Indigenous culture through Indigenous children. To make things simpler, I'll be splitting the topics within this issue into sections based on larger periods of history and specific events. I will start in the 1800s through the mid-1900s with the Native American boarding schools, and then I will go to the 1950s through 1970s with the Indian Adoption Project. The next section will be kind of a short detour from Indigenous children, but to a similar issue of the history of forced sterilization of Indigenous women. And then I'll go to the history of the Indian Child Welfare Act, or the ICWA, placed into law in 1978. Then I will discuss the impact that these things have had on Indigenous children and culture in the past and in current times. And then I'm going to end with a current Supreme Court case that is challenging the ICWA and why this case is so important. All my research resources and things I'm quoting and paraphrasing are in the description below. Whew, that was a lot to take in. Just a note on the terms I'll be using. I mainly refer to Indigenous peoples as either Indigenous or Native Americans. I use the term Indian only in historical context, when quoting historical figures or referring to colonial laws and policies, for example. Generally, though, Indian is not a term that non-Indigenous peoples like myself should be using, since it is inextricable from the racist ideas about global Indian race. The boarding school era is likely the most known of all the topics I will be going over today, as it has been in the news more recent years. However, most people only know the basics. The Native American boarding school era started in the 1860s and did not end until the mid-1900s. Okay, here we go. When the federal government moved Indigenous tribes onto reservations, they were expecting fewer Indigenous children to be born. However, the opposite happened. And the government did not like this. They wanted fewer Indigenous people, not more. So they came up with the idea of sending all the Native American children to boarding schools where they could teach children American culture and hopefully destroy their Native identities. The first on-reservation school was started in 1860 in Washington State. Then in 1878, the first off-reservation boarding school was started. It was called the Carlisle Indian School and was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It was founded by this dude, Richard Henry Pratt. He had run a military prison and had experimented on Indigenous prisoners as a way to destroy their culture. He thought he could implement this on Native American children. He has a famous quote saying, "A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one." In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian children there is in the race should not be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. Clearly a great guy. Not. At the boarding schools, the children were forced to wear uniforms, cut their hair, and get Americanized names. They were not allowed to speak any native languages and were converted to Christianity. In school, they taught so-called American values, such as capitalism, social classes, materialized wealth, and the power of the government. Building on this social class idea, the boys were taught manual labor, and the girls were taught sewing, cooking, and homemaking. The kids were forced to march for hours and even watch offensive cowboy and Indian movies. The boarding schools dealt out harsh punishment for any children showing Indigenous traits. The children were starved, beaten, put in solitary confinement, and many were even sexually assaulted. These schools were often disease-ridden, and many children died there. Often, parents were not even notified if their child died. During the boarding school era, about 357 boarding schools were operating across 30 states during this era, both on and off reservation, and housed over 60,000 Native children. The Indian Adoption Project officially took place from 1958 to 1967, but really ended in the late 1970s. The Indian Adoption Project was a federal program where Native American children were taken from their families and adopted by white families. This came about for many reasons. Indigenous populations were still growing, and it didn't help that multiple problems were forming on reservations. There was debilitating poverty and little working utilities in childcare. It also cost almost $100,000 per child for them to go to the boarding schools, and the government felt that this was way too expensive and they didn't want to have to continue paying. Having the children be adopted meant that they would not need to send the kids to boarding schools, there would be fewer childcare problems on the reservations for them to deal with, and most funding would not be left to the government. Sandy Whitehawk, a Sicangu Lakota from South Dakota, who was adopted at 18 months, said, "It was cheaper to send us to boarding schools than engage us in battle and kill us. And then it became cheaper to have the children adopted than to send them to a boarding school." Another reason was that there was a higher want for babies to adopt, but fewer white babies were available. Abortion and birth control were becoming more accessible, and single unwed mothers were no longer as ostracized. But people still wanted babies, and Native babies were considered preferable to Black babies, reflecting dominant racial hierarchies in the United States. Native American children were considered closer to whiteness than Black children. So the Indian Adoption Project was put into action. It was created by a man named Arnold Leislow in partnership with 3 government agencies: the United States Children's Bureau, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the Child Welfare League of America. The U.S. Children's Bureau participated in assisting and planning for the adoption of Native American children, where the CWLA, or the Child Welfare League of America, ran the project by removing legal barriers for interstate adoptions or solving conflicts in adoption laws and practices. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or the BIA, mainly helped with the financial aspects. The government was cruel in the taking of the Native American children. They found any reason to take a child from their home. Children were taken from hospitals, and parents were told that since their child had gotten sick, they must be an unfit parent. Single parents had children taken because the child must have 2 parents. Parents who were in poverty had their children taken solely due to their financial situation. There's a quote saying, "A survey of a North Dakota tribe indicated that of all the children who were removed from the tribe, only 1% were taken for physical abuse. About 99% were taken based on such vague standards as deprivation, neglect, taken because their homes were thought to be too poverty-stricken to support their children. People were blackmailed, told that they would be taken off welfare or thrown in prison if they did not give up their children. Mothers would sign away their rights directly after giving birth, while still on drugs, being told that they were signing random documents." There's a quote from the Lakota Times saying, "Some of the adoptions were the result of extreme pressure placed on mothers at their most vulnerable time, shaming them into believing white parents could care better and better provide for their children. In other cases, social workers seem to grasp at any reason: a parent's busy work schedule, a lack of indoor plumbing, even failing to come to a complete stop at a stop sign to take children away. But more unscrupulous methods were sometimes used. Women were told their babies had died at birth, and then they were stolen for adoption. Social workers made no effort to understand Indigenous culture, and children were taken due to them being watched by different families, even though it was common practice. Parents would sometimes willingly give up their children, as they had been abused at the boarding schools and didn't want that to happen to their children. Parents were not given the normal rehabilitation services that were normally given to white families to get their children back. Children were separated from their siblings. Some knew they had siblings that they were being separated from, while others never even knew they had siblings. It was said, the notion that Indian parents were unfit to raise their own children had become so ingrained within American society that a state welfare department like that in Texas could convince a court to remove a newborn child despite no evidence or neglect or abuse on the part of the parents. Many white people just also did not understand the situation and felt that this was the best course of action. In a letter to the Supreme Court in 1977, a white woman said, "Surely the type of white parents who are glad to adopt an Indian child are the type who would have the child's best interest at heart. Furthermore, I think adoption is an encouraging effort towards unifying Indians and whites. Much of this individual assistance is going to be necessary to raise children of Indian heritage to be leaders of their own people." This is the true account of a social worker who witnessed and participated in this abuse. Renee Sampson Flood, a social worker in the southeastern South Dakota, from 1980 to 1987, describes a day when she went to a local hospital with another social worker. A young Lakota mother had just given birth and was holding her sleeping baby boy wrapped in a blanket. The social worker barged into the hospital room and pelted her with questions. Are you having trouble finding a place to stay? How will you raise your child without money? What kind of life can you provide for him on the reservation? The social worker told the young woman that if she really loved her baby boy, she would give him a chance in life by allowing him to be adopted by one of a long list of couples who could give him more opportunities in life. Tears ran down the young mother's cheeks and dripped from her chin, Flood remembered. Flood became upset and went out into the hall. It seemed like hours before the social worker finally came out, carrying the signed papers and the tiny baby, Flood recalled. The other social worker scolded Flood for leaving the room and confided to a nurse that the young mother did the right thing. The nurse responded, "They usually do, once they realize their children have no future if they keep them." Flood thought that all the young Lakota mother needed was the right supportive services or perhaps a bus to get home. As Flood and the social worker drove away from the hospital to the foster home, the worker talked incessantly of the negative aspects of reservation life, a disquisition that Flood, who was married to a Yankton Sioux, described as 10 minutes of bigoted generalizations about Indians. They never go to college, their houses are filthy, they all drink, dress in rags, and never bathe, and they all get government checks every month. The social worker had embedded the popular perceptions that adoption advocates, social scientists, had helped to create over several decades. This is just showing the abuse and false narratives that were happening. By the 1960s, between 25% and 35% of all Native children were placed in adoptive homes, foster homes, or institutions. And about 90% of those children were being raised by non-Native Americans. The media was a major factor in the adoption of Indigenous children. Ads were constantly placed in newspapers, advertising all the available children. The media painted Indigenous parents as unfit, and that adopting a Native American child would be saving them from a horrible life. This idea was perpetuated by the current president at the time, Lyndon B. Johnson. He said in 1968, 50,000 Indian families living in unsanitary, dilapidated dwellings, many in huts, shanties, even abandoned automobiles. The unemployment rate among Indians being nearly 40%, more than 10 times the national average. Indian literacy rates being among the lowest in the nation, the rates of sickness and poverty being among the highest. While the Indian Adoption Project officially ended in 1967, the Adoption Resource Exchange of North America, also called ARENA, was founded in 1966. It continued the practice of placing Native American children with white adoptive parents. Officially, 395 Indigenous children were adopted through the Indian Adoption Project. However, this was not the true number of Native Americans adopted at this time. Through ARENA and non-federal agencies, about 12,486 children were adopted between 1961 and 1976. The unfair adoption of Indigenous children was ended in 1978 in the Indian Child Welfare Act, which I will go over a little later. Taking a small detour from the adoption of Native American children, I'm going to pivot to Indigenous women and the horrible things that were done to them. Also, to further the goal of reducing the number of Native Americans and destroying their culture. So, different group of people, same goal. I am going to tell you about the forced sterilization of Indigenous women. I'm going to tell you a true story quoted from the book A Generation Removed by Margaret D. Jacobs, an amazing resource if you want to learn more about all the topics talked about in this video. Norma Jean Serena, a 37-year-old Creek Shawnee woman whom doctors sterilized involuntarily at the age of 32 in a hospital outside Pittsburgh, and whose 3 young children were removed and placed in foster homes. Serena had been born in El Reno, Oklahoma in 1937. She contracted typhoid fever as a child and suffered from hearing loss. She spoke 3 Indian languages, but did not learn English until the age of 9. She married in her 20s and moved in with her husband to Pennsylvania in the mid-1960s. Abandoned by her husband, she turned to public assistance. Child welfare services in Armstrong County, Pennsylvania, intervened in her personal life in early 1970, allegedly because of reports that she was associating with Black people. Caseworkers told Serena that she must come with her children to Pittsburgh for a medical exam. The doctor found nothing wrong with her 2 children, but social workers placed them in foster care. They told Serena it was only temporary, but informed the foster parents it was permanent. Serena was pregnant at the time. Without her knowledge or consent, doctors sterilized her on August 18, 1970, less than 48 hours after her 3rd child had been born. She did sign an official consent form the day after the operation, but at the time she was still medicated. Medical personnel listed the reason for sterilization as socioeconomic. Serena repeatedly attempted to get her children back, but was thwarted by social workers. A jury ruled in 1973 that her children should be returned to her and awarded her $17,000 in damages. But authorities delayed the children's return for almost a year. She filed a lawsuit in federal court against 6 caseworkers, 2 physicians, and an administrator of various child welfare services, but she lost the case in 1979. By the 1950s, when the Indian Health Service was created, the vast majority of Native American women gave birth in hospitals. And this is what really started the involuntary sterilization of Native American women. The Family Planning Services and Population Research Act of 1970, a government act, subsidized sterilization for Medicaid and Indian Health Service patients. Since most Indigenous people got their health care through these things, it made the likelihood of sterilization higher. Brianna Theobald, a history professor at the University of Rochester, said this: "The federal government and local authorities have long tried to control Indigenous families and women's reproduction, using tactics such as coercive sterilization and the removal of Indigenous children into the white foster care system. This again connects the sterilization and the adoption of Native American children as a way to destroy Indigenous culture." During the period that followed the passage of the Family Planning Services and Population Research Act of 1970, physicians sterilized around 25% of Native American women of childbearing age. And there's evidence that the numbers were possibly even higher. Most of these procedures were performed under pressure, duress, or without the women's knowledge and understanding. Many were on drugs from childbirth, which would make them groggy, and they would be told they were signing different health forms. Some women were not forced, but convinced that this would be the best decision for them, due to the rough life they were living. Yet it's easy to say how this was the government's doing. It is thought that about approximately 3,406 Native American women were sterilized without informed consent. In the 1970s, Native activism and resistance became more active and widespread. Women of all red nations was formed. They took on the sterilization abuse, and the U.S. Government Accountability Office started to investigate the issue in 1976, really only due to public pressure. They released a report which said that the government was not doing anything wrong, but they thought that there could be some consent issues. After this report was released, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare adopted new regulations that offered some regulations for women which went into effect into 1979. The new regulations required, for example, an extended waiting period from 72 hours to 30 days between consent and an operation. So, while this horrific practice was ended, this was a period of eugenics, and there's no other way to put it. The Indian Child Welfare Act was the thing that ended the adoption era for Indigenous children. It was enacted in 1978 after a major Supreme Court case. It shed light on the factors that heightened the removal of Native American children. For example, the parents not knowing the content of the documents that the social workers made them sign, a social worker's biased view of Native culture, the unfair treatment of Native American parents, the lack of information given to the tribes that obstructed their ability to transfer the case onto their jurisdiction, and many of the other things I listed earlier. Mainly 3 factors were highlighted: economic, historical, interrelational, and psychological causes. The 3 main aspects of the act were recognition of tribal sovereignty, meaning reflected in jurisdictional mandates, including the presumption that tribal courts are in the best position to make decisions regarding the interests of Indigenous children. Preservation of Indian families, reflected in the provision of active efforts required to keep Indigenous families together, including providing at-risk families with social support. Tribal and family connectedness, reflected in the placement preferences. Indian children must be placed within their extended families or tribes, if at all possible, when are removed from their homes. The Act recognizes the authority of both tribal and state courts to make decisions regarding the welfare, care, custody, and control of Native American children, and also assists Native tribes in the operation of child and family service programs. Before the ICWA, about 75 to 80% of Native American families living on reservations lost at least one child to the foster care and adoption system. A Choctaw tribal chief, Calvin Isaac, said during the U.S. Senate testimony before the passage of the ICWA, one of the most serious failings of the present system is that Indian children are removed from the custody of their natural parents by non-tribal governmental authorities who have no basis for intelligently evaluating the cultural and social premises underlying Indian home life and child rearing. Many of the individuals who decide the fate of our children, at best, ignorant of our cultural values, and at worst, have contempt for the Indian way and convinced that removal, usually to a non-Indian household or institution, can only benefit an Indian child. While this was a very good solution, as you will see later, this is still a very ongoing issue. I feel it's impossible to understand the impact and injustice that was caused to the Indigenous children, families, and tribes without hearing the true stories and words of the people who lived it. So this section is going to just be quotes from children who were adopted. Many of the adopted children share the same issue or similar issues. They felt a severe loss of identity, not knowing who they were, or where they came from, or where they fit. An adopted Indigenous man who goes by St. John said, "I'm more than glad to tell you, I am pissed off. I was the youngest of 16 children, grabbed at the age of 4, along with 3 older brothers. No paperwork, nothing. The other kids in the family escaped because they took off. We were on the front page of the newspaper, along with lots of good talk about the holiday and adoption. We were brought up without our culture, which took a terrible toll on our lives. I grew up angry and miserable." Another Indigenous adoptee, Lupe Crable, shares a similar story, saying, "I was not enrolled. I had no documentation of that, and I had no idea what tribe. So it was allegedly a part of who I was, but I had no validation of that. It's this feeling. It was just a lot of displacement. Sometimes I don't know where I fit. I've never lived on a reservation. I've always lived in a white family. but you can't prove it because it's like, well, where's your card? What tribe? You really don't know your identity. In another quote from A Generation Removed, an adoptee says, "My adoptive mother constantly reminded me that no matter what I did, I came from a pagan race whose only hope for redemption was to assimilate into white culture." The last quote I'm going to include, I feel, sums up a lot of the feelings that many Indigenous adoptees seem to feel, at least as far as my research has shown. It describes what is called split feather syndrome, or the damage caused by the loss of tribal identity and growing up different in an unwelcoming world. It is said by an Indigenous man named White Hawk, even in loving families, Native adoptees live without a sense of who they are. Love doesn't provide identity because through adoption we are living away from our homelands, away from our communities, and away from our families. We don't have a sense of who we are as an Indian person. We only have a sense of survival and making it work and trying to fit in. The effects of the boarding school and the adoption era are still being felt today. Despite the ICWA, the amount of Native American children in the foster care system remains disproportionately high. Some quoted statistics from Indian Country Today state, in Alaska, Native children make up 18% of the child population, but 55% of the children in foster care. In South Dakota, Native American kids are 15% of the state's youngsters, but 53% of those in foster care. Other states topping the list for skewed numbers include Minnesota, where the overrepresentation of Native kids in foster care increased substantially from 2004 to 2009, Montana, Nebraska, and North Dakota. Judges tend not to know the ICWA and therefore do not enforce it. A 2017 report by the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges said Native American children are 3 times as likely to be placed in foster care. In some states, this is even higher. In Minnesota, Native kids are 17 times more likely than non-Native kids to be removed from their parents. In 2011, an NPR series found that despite the availability of Native foster parents, 90% of Native American children in the foster care system in South Dakota were still placed in group homes or with non-Native families. Due to the impacts of split feather syndrome, many of the adoption children suffered from alcohol and drug abuse, as well as depression and suicidal thoughts. Many struggle to find their birth certificates and sometimes even what tribe they're from. All this does is make their sense of identity even worse. This is forced assimilation and a cultural genocide. It prevented traditions, stories, and legacies to be passed on. And it's possible it could get even worse soon. On November 9th, 2022, a case was heard in the Supreme Court of the United States, a case called Burkine v. Holland. It was brought to the court by Texas, Louisiana, and Indiana, and wants to declare the ICWA unconstitutional. The case goes as follows. In June 2016, a 10-month-old Navajo boy was placed with Chad and Jennifer Burkine. The father of the child is Cherokee, and the mother is Navajo. In 2017, a Texas state court terminated the parental rights of both biological parents. Under the rules of the ICWA, the Navajo Nation stepped in and tried to place the child with a Navajo family, but that failed, and the Burkines adopted the child. The Burkines later attempted to adopt the boy's sister as well, but the girl's extended family also wanted to take in the girl, so that the girl could be raised with her Navajo family and culture, the sort of outcome the ICWA wants. The Burkines then filed suit in federal court to overturn the ICWA on the grounds of racial discrimination. The Burkines were arguing that the ICWA enshrines into law the disparate treatment of Native children and non-Native children. They claimed that this violated the Equal Protection Clause under the Fifth Amendment, which prohibits the disparate treatment on the basis of race. They argued that they were better suited to raise the girl, pointing to the size of their home and their private pool. There are 2 other similar cases attached to this main case as well. It's a little confusing. In a nutshell, a non-Indigenous couple wants to adopt an Indigenous child and they're being stopped by the ICWA. They are saying that this is unconstitutional and that they are being racially discriminated against. As I said, this case was heard in the Supreme Court on November 9th, 2022. The justices seem to be very mixed on the issue overall. While the more liberal justices seem to be on the side of the tribes, the more conservative justices, while not exactly on the side of the Burkines, had concerns about certain aspects of the ICWA, such as the third preference, the preference that if a Native American child cannot be placed with either members of their extended family, the first preference, or members of the same tribe, the second preference, they be placed with members of another tribe. Also, the idea that the state must actively try to stop the breakup of a Native American family was also under contention. Some were concerned that the priority of having Native American adoptive parents may trump the best interests of the child. As there is a conservative majority in the Supreme Court currently, the result of this case remains up in the air. If the ICWA is overturned, there could be major consequences for things such as tribal sovereignty, tribal erasure, and more. Sadly, right now all we can do is sit and wait. I implore you to do more research on the topics I talked about today, whether this was fascinating to you or you found this mind-numbingly boring. As I said in the beginning, all of my research resources are in the description below. This is such an important and under-talked about topic, so tell people, share the resources, share this video, spread awareness. Thank you for watching and listening.